Hi folks, I'm Nick Reid from Reid Stock Feeds, General Manager, and this year we want to do things a little bit differently through our communication channels. I'm not sure whether to look at Gerard on my screen here or up at the camera. I might just look at the screen, but we've got in mind to run a number of expert interviews this year across a broad range of topics related to livestock agriculture and better feeding of livestock and all the scenarios that are connected to that. So we wanted to kick things off by looking at some of the commodities we work with, and in particular today, wheat. So Gerard McMullen, his name was raised to me while doing the background and research on who to talk to as an industry expert, and I have had the pleasure of meeting Gerard on a previous occasion when he came out to our Colbinaban base and presented to our millers on quality standards and issues and weeds and seeds and things like that that the guys should be looking out for on the weighbridge. And I think since that point in time, we've also ran further training for our miller group just in more recent times. So, Gerard, what I know about you from talking to others and hopping on LinkedIn and all the usual places online is that for 12 years or thereabouts, you were the Manager of Quality Assurance and Hygiene at the Australian Wheat Board, or AWB as it's more commonly known. And since leaving the AWB, you've gone into independent consulting under the name of McMullen Consulting, and you've been doing that for the last 14 years. Can you start off perhaps by telling us how it was that you developed an interest in the grains industry and what led you down that path?
Yeah, look, thanks, Nick. When I left school, I started at Melbourne Uni in agricultural science because I came off a farm in Tasmania. Nothing to do with grain. It was wheat. It was a dairy and apple orchard.
Wow. What part of Tassie?
Down the Huon Valley. So beautiful part of the countryside.
Sure is.
And so I went to Melbourne Uni, did agricultural science because that was a sort of a natural fit. Majored in animals when I finished at Melbourne Uni and started picking apples and then went into plants, i.e. Australian Wheat Board. So as you do, completely different than what I thought I was going to get into.
Yeah.
And I started out a couple of years as a field officer in Horsham and Echuca. So I got some really solid grounding out there in the bush. And then after about 3 or 4 years, moved into head office, into the quality assurance section. And as you say, yes, headed it up for 12 or 13 years and then left about 2005.
So talk to us a little bit more specifically around this quality assurance and hygiene at AWB and when you're describing what that role was all about. I suppose I'm thinking of an audience that knows very little about the grain growing scene. So what sort of projects were you keeping across there?
I was part of the QA program. We were responsible because obviously in those days we had the single desk. We were responsible for setting the standards for wheat across the country, so for all of the receivable standards. And that also involved that we were the buyer of last resort. So any quality that was actually produced, we had to set a grade for that. And then as part of that role, we were obviously responsible for selling that grain. So the QA section not only did set the standards, but we also analysed the crop quality, not just for its physical quality parameters like protein, moisture, etc., but we had our own laboratory. So I was responsible for ensuring our laboratory milled it, made all the different grades into all of the different products. Then we looked at all of the food safety issues with that grain, so things like chemicals, heavy metals, mycotoxins, all of those food safety issues. And then we looked at all of the quarantine issues for all of the markets that we went to. So things like weed, seeds, pests, diseases. And my section was responsible for pulling all of that information together and giving it to the marketers. And they were then, they had technical people technical millers that went around the world and tried to convince the customers that this grain is suitable for you. So we basically liaised with all of the quarantine people in Australia and overseas and all of those food safety people to make sure that the Australian grain could meet all of our customer requirements. And Nick, that wasn't just for export, that was also for domestic as well.
It sounds like from that job you'd know a few people in the grains industry.
It gave me a great background. I travelled around Australia and met a lot of people. And it wasn't just for wheat. So towards the end of the AWB role, we're heavily involved in a lot of the other commodities as well. So things like the barley, the sorghum, and the pulses, etc.
Okay, so just expanding on that a bit around different quality standards and remembering to take this from the point of view of someone that knows very little about wheats and barley, but with the focus on wheat, why is it that we have different quality standards? What does that allow?
By having different standards, that allows us to differentiate the crop itself. So rather than put it all into a great big bin, for example, and then select the different bins for different customers, we can actually segregate the grain based on the inherent quality that both the varieties that are being produced and also the physical qualities. And that then enables us to have discrete parcels that industry can pick and choose based on the quality for whichever customer comes in with the right price.
So a fairly broad question, this one. You have different species of wheat and you have different parameters determining what quality setting that wheat is at. What markets are those species and quality parameters suited to? So if you start with quality parameters, what markets do they funnel out into? And then conversely, what species fit within those quality buckets, if you like?
So Nick, when you're talking about species, we're basically going down to the level of variety.
Yeah.
So we have a classification system here in Australia, which is done by Wheat Quality Australia, which classifies the inherent qualities of those varieties into the different classes, which are suitable for different end products. So just because you have a variety that's, for example, producing a really high protein, say minimum 13%, doesn't mean to say that it is going to make good noodles or loaf breads. There's quality requirements within that. So that's what the classification system is all about.
Sure. And what are some of the different markets from your premium grade right down into your lower grades that wheat can be marketed at?
Yes, well, I guess, Nick, these are very general comments because markets do change. And as you'd be well aware, even within Australia, based on availability, i.e. tonnage, and also on the price, markets are very selective these days, but they will also go to other suppliers based on what the price is. So I guess if you have a look at the major grades that we produce here in Australia in a normal season, and I'm not quite sure what a normal season is these days. It seems to be fairly topsy-turvy, but if you look at the highest protein, the APH grades, that's the yellow alkaline noodles for the Chinese yellow alkaline noodles, and also the Japanese ramen noodles. So they're those noodles that we have in the soups, and there's some very specific quality parameters required for that in terms of texture and colour. Probably the biggest grade, I guess, that growers try to produce is the hard wheats. So virtually all the way across the country. And those hard wheats go to a range of markets, traditionally in the Middle East and all parts of Asia, whether it be North Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, etc. But I guess it's probably fair to say these days we've got a fairly big market share in the Asian markets, and they're used for all of those quite a few Asian products. You can have a look at Middle Eastern flatbreads, the European pan breads, and a lot of those Asian markets are producing those types of products. So when you think about Asia now, it's not just about noodles, it's about those pan breads that the consumer is progressing towards.
So the Asian market has diversified itself just in terms of the product that it makes out of flour to be globally distributed.
Oh, definitely. So, with the competition that we have these days, it's not just Australian grain or traditionally Australian grain, Canadian and US wheat being the main supplies into these markets. You're getting, the Black Sea and other suppliers based on the production. And these markets are getting very sophisticated, and they know how to blend to make the different products. And of course, their consumers, they've got greater income, and as they've got greater income, they're moving more towards the European style breads, away from the instant noodle type products. But that said, those products are still very important in some of those markets.
So you've spoken about hard wheats. What's in below that?
Yep. So in below that, so the hard wheat's basically minimum protein of 11.5%. If the grower doesn't meet that, well, then the next grade is the APW, so the Australian Premium White, which is basically minimum 10.5% protein. And that's a fairly versatile product, able to be used for a lot of Middle Eastern style flatbreads or the pocket breads. It can be used for a lot of the Chinese steam breads, a lot of the Asian noodles. So there's a multitude of different Asian noodles, but I guess the three that come to mind would be your instant noodles, your fresh noodles, and your Hokkien noodles.
So your 2-minute noodles, that's APW.
Yes, but it's also the next grade, which is ASW. So depending on the quality of the product that the customer wants to make, they will be blending, or they'll be using ASW, APW, or in fact they may even be able to be blending some hard wheat in there as well. So there's no hard and fast rule. It depends on what the miller themselves and the customer themselves understands in terms of the quality of the grain, and then they'll make those ratios of the blends, etc.
Mm-hmm.
The general purpose grade that we have here in Australia, which is probably a fairly significant tonnage, is the Australian Standard White, or ASW grade, which doesn't have a protein minimum, and that's really just an all-purpose flour. Again, a lot of those Middle Eastern style products, the Iranian breads, the Indian breads, the naans, the chapatis that we commonly eat, all sorts of noodles, again, breads, rolls, etc. So it's a very general purpose flour.
And what about below ASW?
So below ASW, I guess the next one would be the soft, and we don't grow very much soft these days, but that's what we generally use for your biscuits, your cakes, your confectionery, those sorts of things. So all that sweet stuff, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
And then below that, I shouldn't say below that, but another important market is the noodle market for Japan and Korea, and that's mainly from WA, where they have a very specific requirement for protein and varieties to make their Japanese udon noodles, for example.
Yeah, you're right. I guess there's not a top and a bottom. Farmers, depending on where their geography is and how the conditions suitable, obviously purposely grow a particular crop, not because of higher returns, but because the landscape and soil suits that particular species rather than what it might return. Is that correct?
Yeah. So it's basically just when the grower chooses which varieties they're going to grow, there's a whole range of different, obviously, reasons why they'll pick a particular variety, but generally these days, unless they're involved in that soft or that noodle type market, they'll generally try and grow a hard variety, unless they're up northern New South Wales, Queensland, where they might try and most of that is they'll be growing that prime hard variety to try and get that premium and that higher protein. But generally down the east coast and southeast Australia, they'll be growing hard varieties, so that they have the option, if the conditions are right, they can get into those hard grades. If they don't meet the protein requirements, they can still get into the APW or down into the ASW based on the other quality parameters.
Going away from human consumption, what grades tend to fit more often than not into livestock feed, stock feed?
Look, I guess it really just depends on from a livestock producer what they can source. So if you have a look at all of those milling grades, which I just talked about, if those grades don't, or if the deliveries from the farmer don't meet those specifications, then it will be downgraded into what we call a non-milling grade, or if for other purposes, a stock feed grade, if you like. And so therefore, from a stock feeder, you've got that non-milling grade supplies, depending on the quality. But there are also in some regions some non-milling grade varieties that are grown. So things like your red wheats or your spring feed wheats, grown basically specifically for, if you like, tonnage to get those yields. But that said, they still need to meet minimum requirements of quality as well. So you'd be well aware, Nick, in a lot of cases, from a stock feed perspective, the specifications for a lot of that stock feed grain is basically as per, for example, ASW. So it still needs to be reasonably contaminant free, needs to have a reasonable quality. Otherwise, I guess the value for you guys is not suitable.
In your opinion, is there much nutritional difference between a similar size red wheat to that of ASW?
Look, I'm not an animal nutritionist, and I think from a stock feed perspective, different species have different requirements in terms of energy values, etc. But generally, what we tend to say is if you've got a high test weight, i.e. you've got really plump grains, then you've got a reasonable protein, you've got a reasonable energy yield. So is there a significant difference between, say, an ASW milling wheat versus an ASW type red wheat? Probably not a significant difference, but I'd let experts prove me wrong there.
Sure. I just thought I'd ask you because you've got the animal science degree there at Melbourne University. I was just trying to dig back into your past knowledge there and see whether it was resurfacing.
It's too long ago, Nick.
You could have been a nutritionist for Reid stock feeds, Gerard, if you had that sliding door effect. Anyway, you've been more than capable at the path you have chosen, so good on you. In terms of what separates ASW from, say, a feed wheat, what are some of the things there that test out to create that separation?
So when we look at the standards, there's probably four areas that we set in standards. So whether it be for a feed wheat or a milling wheat, and I guess the main ones that we look at are protein, moisture, screenings, and test weight. So they're fairly important. They give a basic understanding, if you like, of the inherent quality of the grain. Then we look at whether there's any defects in the grain, so things like sprouted grain, frost damaged, stained, etc. And then the third and fourth is all about contaminants. So we have a section we have standards for weed seeds, so various weed seeds in the different grades, and then basically any other contaminants as well. So whether it be soil, earth, insects, those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. So those four sections are applied in standards to all grain, whether it be feed or whether it be milling quality. And I guess it's probably fair to say that if you're buying wheat, you don't want any contaminants in there. And the better the quality in terms of lack of damage from frost or staining, etc., the better off you're going to be both from a quality point of view and I guess also from an energy point of view as well.
So you talked about moisture and screenings. What are those two variables? What are you measuring for there specifically under those variables? And what's the necessity to test for those?
So from a moisture perspective, Australian grain's regarded as being very, very dry. So as you'd be aware, in our harvest conditions, it's normally pretty hot. So the grain that comes in is very dry. That then means that it's, I guess it's plus and a negative. The plus is that it's able to be stored very well. So if you have high moisture content in storage and you are going to store that grain for any extended period of time, then it's potentially prone to moisture damage in storage. So we have a significant advantage there over, say, the North Americans. Conversely, by being very dry and that grain coming in very hot, it is also prone to insect damage in storage. So there's a plus and negative about the moisture as well. I guess from a milling point of view, our buyers do like our grain being of a very low moisture content. That means that they can control that milling process. They add that water, and it means that it's again, it's more stable from a storage point of view.
Sure. And screenings?
So screenings is really all about small grains and some of that foreign material or all of those weed seeds, etc., that's in the grain. So we like to say that we have a low screenings content, because again, when you're buying grain for whatever purpose, unless it's for industrial, generally what you want from a milling or from a stock feed point of view, you want those nice plump grains, so that you've got some high protein, and you've also got from an energy point of view for the stock feed point of view. So you want low screening. So again, low contaminants and also low levels of small grains, which maybe arise through a tough finish where the grains are all really small, or worst case scenario where we have some fairly significant frost during that flowering period, and it affects the size of the grains and also the inherent quality within those grains as well.
Another two variables you discussed there were black tip grains and sprouted grains. What growing conditions will present seeds like that?
Yeah, well, look, I guess when you're looking at defects like sprouted and stained, there's probably not a lot that the grower can do to manage those, other than, I guess, variety selection. So whether it's an early season, late season, or if it looks like there is going to be some inclement weather, that they will get in there and harvest it, as early as possible. But generally with sprouted grain, it's a result of moisture damage during the harvest period. So when that grain is out there in the paddock and it's ripe, if it stays wet for generally what we say is more than about 48 hours, then it will start that germination process, i.e. that's what happens at sowing time when add water and it starts to grow. And that will potentially reduce the not only the energy value, but it also potentially will reduce the inherent quality. But it depends on the level of moisture, the extent of the sprouting, etc., as to when you start to see those effects. From a staining point of view, similar scenario. There's two schools of thought here in terms of the causes for staining. One is that you have a little bit of humidity and a little bit of moisture, and you will start to get some staining on the grain. So it will cause a visual defect on the grain. But there's also a biochemical reaction as well. And I won't try and explain that because I don't really understand that either.
And there isn't a hope in hell that I'll understand you either, so let's not go there. What has been one of the greatest technological improvements you've seen in the grains industry? And I'll let you go anywhere you want with that since you began with the AWB.
Oh, that's a good question, Nick. I've been in the industry 35 years, and there's been some massive changes over that time. I think from my job experience, I guess, in the QA area, I think the testing technology has made some fantastic leaps and bounds in terms of the ability of not only the post-farm gate sector, but also the growers to access technology to understand the quality of the grain that they are producing. And I think that's been an enormous step forward, and it has enabled us to be able to segregate the grain either in the bulk handling system or on farm increasingly these days, so that we can segregate it and maximise the value of that grain.
Do you mean there's more accessible tools for the grower at the home farm to be able to carry those tests out themselves, or have experts come in and do that?
Look, it's a bit of both, but I guess some of the more sophisticated growers these days are putting up a lot more on-farm storage, and they want to run that business as a true bulk handling company. And so they've got the ability now to understand the quality of the grain that they're harvesting, and put it into bins to segregate and maximise the quality that they've segregated, but then also the ability on outturn, because they do know the quality of that grain, to be able to blend and again maximise the value of that grain. So I think that testing technology has enabled them to do that. But I think also coupled with that is the storage, the different types of storages that are available to growers. Some fantastic on-farm setups out there these days, which enables them to not only maintain the quality that they do store on farm, but also make sure that it is free of insects as well, which is obviously another set of marketing standards where we have a freedom from livestock grain insects.
Great. I could go down all sorts of pathways with some of these answers, but I'll just ask you one more question, just in the interest of time and people's decreasing capacity to focus on things like this. So another broad one for you. I'm glad it's you answering, and I just get the easy part of asking the questions. But in terms of the marketing channels for grain produced in Australia, how has that changed over the last decade in terms of percentages of what's made, and then whether it's domestic focus or international focus?
Look, as I said before, Nick, I think that we're facing a lot more competition these days. So we no longer have a huge market, if you like, in the Middle East. So we are focusing more, or tend to be focusing more, on Southeast Asia and trying to diversify the products with those customers. At the same time, the customers are, I guess, demanding a greater quality product and demanding a greater service. So there's a lot of work being done by a lot of people all the way through the supply chain, from the breeding companies through to the people who are promoting the use and the quality of Australian grain. So that's been a massive change in the last few years. And then I guess the second part of the answer is I guess where we've seen on the East Coast in the last 2 or 3 years, where we've seen the pretty difficult conditions of growing the crop. That has also been a fairly significant change, whereby we've been seeing grain move across the countryside, and that's created a whole range of concerns as well. It's new space for just about everyone, and not only for the end users, but also for the growers. But it's also from a biosecurity point of view, because we do value our biosecurity and make sure that we have minimal diseases in all of our grain. So I think that's been a fairly significant task. But that said, I think despite all of the difficulties, I think we've managed to meet requirements for both the domestic guys, but also continue to trade on the export market. We just need some water to grow a little bit more.
Been a bit coming through, at least in southern Victoria these past few weeks, but of course it's of no use to the Australian wheat or barley grower at this time of year, being middle of January. Just forgot where we were in the 12-month calendar for a moment there. Where's the most idyllic, quintessential Australian grain growing landscape that you've visited? I won't pick out a particular location because... come on, be brave.
No, because next time I go into another area, they say, what, you picked there? You've got to be joking. But I will say that when I first started out, the Western District in Victoria, when I was working in Horsham, I used to go all the way down to Portland through Hamilton, all of those areas there. To be honest, the quality of grain down there wasn't very good in those days, and I'm talking mid-80s. The quality that they produce down there now rivals the quality just about anywhere across the country. So that's been a significant change, and I think that there's been a lot in the supply chain that have attributed, or you could attribute that to. But I guess my favourite spot is the Liverpool Plains. When they do get some rain, they can produce massive tons of grain, and it is really good quality. And I guess that's always been my favourite sort of area.
All right, now you've just offended all the growers in other regions, like you said you didn't want to do, but I'm glad you answered it because it was a really interesting answer. So final question is, if you were Tom Hanks in Castaway and you were marooned on an island without reception, what 3 objects would you take with you? I didn't have this on the question list that I sent you, did I?
I've got no idea, but probably a football.
Footy?
Yeah, probably a footy.
Aussie rules or rugby?
Oh, Aussie rules. Down here in Victoria. I'd probably take a golf club and a golf ball.
Oh, righto. Just to entertain yourself.
Well, there's no technology, and what would I need technology for? So you've got to have something to do.
Sure. It sounds like you're pretty handy with your survival skills. You'd be able to build the bush hut and all that sort of thing.
Well, we'd have to adapt, I
think. Gerard, thanks for taking the time today. I've really appreciated talking to you. I think there's some fascinating material in here, and I just look forward to cutting it up. So thanks very much.
All right, not a problem, Nick.
Go on, Gerard.